Hey, what's going on, guys? It's etaprime back here again. Today we're going to be putting together a 12th gen Intel build, and I've been really excited about this. I've actually had the parts for a little while, but just haven't found the time to put this together. Now, I've checked out benchmarks on the new 12th gens, be it the i5 or the i7 or even the i9. And for this build here, I opted for the i5 12600K. I think we got plenty of power with that CPU. From the benchmarks that I've seen so far, it looks like a really good performer in multi-core and single-core performance. And single core is really what I'm most excited about with 12th gen. When it comes to emulation, you need a good CPU with great single core performance, and I think these 12th gens are definitely going to put it out for us. So for my first video on Intel 12th gen, we're going to do a build, we're going to test out some PC games, and then we're going to hop into some emulation. I suspect we're going to be getting amazing performance in emulation, so I will have another video with a lower end GPU, maybe even just the iGPU on that 12600K, because I do know how hard it can be to get GPUs right now. But we're going to go ahead and jump right into the build, and as I'm going, I'll tell you exactly what parts I'm using. I'll also leave links for everything in the description. So for the motherboard, I opted for the MSI MPG Carbon Z690. Really amazing motherboard with tons of I/O, and obviously it supports 12th gen Intel, and it supports DDR5. And that brings me to the RAM I'm going to be using in this build. I went with 32 gigabytes of T-Force Delta DDR5 at 6400 megahertz. Now, I'm not exactly sure if we're going to be able to reach that max clock of 6400 on the board and the CPU I chose, but we'll definitely try it out. When it comes to storage, I opted for some Kingston Fury Renegade. This is an M.2 NVMe SSD, and it's a 2 terabyte drive. And obviously, we went with the i5 12600K. So let's go ahead and throw this thing together real quick. I'm not going to do a full build tutorial, but I kind of just wanted to go over it. So when it comes to these new Intel 12th gens, they use a whole new socket. It's LGA 1700. So obviously you will need a whole new motherboard with a new chipset. And unfortunately, LGA 1700 also requires a different bracket for the cooler. Now there are a few manufacturers out there offering free brackets for your older coolers, or you could just opt to pick something up that comes right out of the box with an LGA 1700 bracket. So now that we have the CPU in place, I'm going to go ahead and install my RAM. And sometimes you might want to do this last if you have a bigger cooler. I think I'll be able to get by with what I'm using here though. And I really do hope I can take this DDR5 up to 6400 megahertz. This MSI MPG Carbon board has a ton of M.2 slots. I'm just going to use number 1 up top here. And I probably should have went with the mid section just so I could replace this if I ever needed to without removing the cooler. But I've already taken the cooler plate off, so I'm just going to go with this slot here. So I've been using these ID cooling coolers for a little while now and never had an issue, be it an all-in-one cooler or a tower cooler like we have here. And recently I saw they added the LGA 1700 bracket to their SE226XT. So I opted for this cooler here. It does have 6 heat pipes and was actually on sale for their early Black Friday deal, so I really couldn't pass it up. So now I have my storage, my RAM, my CPU, and cooler installed on this motherboard. It's time to move over to the case. And the case I'm going to be using for this build is the Galax Revolution 01 in white. I personally love the look of this case. We do have a tempered glass side panel here, 4 RGB fans pre-installed. It does have its own RGB controller, but you can always connect these to your motherboard's RGB out if you want to do it that way. But this case does include 2 buttons up top to control the brightness, and you can cycle through the RGB modes. And it also goes perfectly with the GPU I chose. This is the Galax GeForce RTX 3060 EX series. And once it's finished up, it looks something like this. I'm going to go ahead and power it up for the first time. I've got all that RGB plugged in to the included controller on the case itself. That way I can just press these buttons up top here and change the mode. We can cycle through a few different RGB modes. We also have brightness, so we can turn it completely off from the case itself. Like I mentioned, you can always connect this to the RGB output on your motherboard, but I personally kind of like the way this is set up. So with everything installed and powered up, the last thing I need to do is install Windows. I think I'm just going to go with Windows 11 because I already have a USB stick flashed with it right now. I'll get some games, emulators, and benchmarks installed, and I'll be right back. Alright, so before we jump into testing, I wanted to give you a quick look here. As you can see, we have that i5 12600K, and what makes these new 12th gen Intels a bit different is the way they have the cores set up. We have a total of 10 cores and 16 threads with this CPU here. 6 performance cores and 4 efficiency cores. Max turbo on the performance cores is 4.9. Max turbo on the efficiency cores is 3.6. And I've done a little bit of testing. This CPU is absolutely amazing. I'm blown away by the performance on this thing. 32 gigabytes of DDR5, and I could only get it up to 6200 megahertz stably. Now, if I did some more tuning and messed with it for a little while, I could probably take it up a bit higher. But we're stable at 6200 and it's looking good. The newer 12th gen Intels also have UHD 770 graphics built in, but we're not going to worry about that right now for this video because we have that RTX 3060 with 12 gigabytes of VRAM. The very first thing I always like to do with these new builds is run some benchmarks. And first on the list, coming in with a very impressive single and multi-core score, we have Geekbench 5. Single core 1869, multi 13,298. Next on the list, Cinebench R23. Keep in mind, these are the stock clocks. There's no overclocking going on whatsoever. Total multi-core score 17,397. I also ran a few 3D Mark tests. First up, Night Raid 57,546, Firestrike 20,982, and finally, Time Spy with a 9,390. So in my opinion, these are some really impressive scores given that we only have that RTX 3060. It really comes down to that CPU side of things. I am blown away by the performance of this new chip. But those are benchmarks, and now we need to get down to some real-world game performance. And first up, we have Haly Infinite, 1440p, ultra settings. I got an average of 71 FPS by the end of my run here. I was hoping to get a little more out of it at 1440p, but this is more than playable. I always like to throw at least one fighting game in the mix, so here we have Injustice 2, very high settings. There's no ultra setting here that I can find. 1440p, it's going to run at 60 all day. We're getting amazing performance here. This system also handled Forza Horizon 5 like a champ. We're at 1440p, ultra settings. We got an average of 98 FPS. Looking really good here at 1440. I actually wasn't expecting Doom Eternal to do so well, but here we are at 1440p nightmare settings. We got an average of 121 FPS out of this. I'm pretty sure we could go up to 4K and lock it at 60 with this setup. And the final game I wanted to test here was Dirt 5, 1440p, ultra settings, and this is just a really hard game to run, but we did average 65 FPS at 1440p ultra with this. Now it's time to move over to some emulation, and I can tell you right now that this is definitely one of the best CPUs that I've ever tested for any kind of emulation. We've got really great single core performance, and here we have Xenia, the Xbox 360 emulator, running Red Dead Redemption at 60 FPS, actually a little over. With other CPUs, I always run into issues with this game here where it won't even get over around 45, but we're sitting at around 64 with this. It is looking really good for emulation on 12th gen. Next, we're going to take a look at a little bit of Wii U emulation using CEMU. We got the Vulkan backend going here, 60 FPS, and we are at 4K with this system. I know we have that RTX 3060, but I'm pretty sure we'd be able to pull this off with something a little lower end, like a 1650. So keep an eye on the channel because just seeing, Xbox 360 and Wii U emulation performance on this CPU, I'll definitely be making a couple more videos. And the final emulator I wanted to test, at least for this video, was RPCS3 for PS3. Vulkan backend, also at 4K. This is Skate 3 running at full speed. It's not the hardest game to run, but it does take quite a bit of CPU power to push this game. And as you can see, it's basically running flawlessly. So in the end, I gotta say that this build turned out great for PC gaming and especially emulation. Like I mentioned, I will have a dedicated video coming up, so keep an eye on the channel. I'm really interested to see what this 12600K can do with other higher end emulators. And for that video, we'll go with the lower end GPU, and we might even just test out the built-in iGPU to see what we can do with that. Straight off the bat with that iGPU, I don't think we're going to be hitting 4K, but I think 1080p and even with some of them, 1440 may be possible. But yeah, these new 12th gen Intel CPUs are really impressive, and I can't wait to do some more testing. But if you're interested in building something similar to what you saw in this video, I will leave a few links in the description, and if there's anything else you want to see tested on this specific rig right here, the way it's set up, just let me know in the comments below. But that's going to wrap it up for this one, and like always, thanks for watching.